Hello and welcome to the Public Sector I Heart You podcast. I'm Annie Sandy, Director at West Midlands Employers, and I'm pleased to introduce you today to Shoshana, our guest from the Fairy Job Mother. Shoshana, welcome. Could you tell us a little bit about Fairy Job Mother, just for our listeners out there?
Yeah, thank you, Manny. Really excited to be here and to chat with you today. As you said, my name is Shoshana. I am founder of Fairy Job Mother. And actually, I've just updated all of my kind of messaging. So this is probably going to be the first time I'm saying it with like the new revamped messaging.
Oh, wow.
So this is a good practice. And essentially, Fairy Job Mother is on a mission to empower young people with the skills and confidence to thrive at work, and also support line managers and leaders to empower and engage them as well. So I work directly with lots of young people. I work directly with lots of employers to essentially help both sides understand each other better and thrive and have a good time at work.
Excellent, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. So can you tell us a little bit more about, just to kind of set the scene, about who Gen Z and Gen Alpha actually are?
Yes, absolutely. So obviously Gen Z is a generation, so anyone born between the years of 1997 to 2012. So currently the youngest age group that is in the workforce. So essentially anyone that is between the ages of like 15 to kind of 27 falls into that age bracket. And I can talk about some of the differences in a second. So that's specifically Gen Z, and then Gen Alpha is essentially the generation or the age group below that. So anyone that is born after 2012. So I believe 14 and under. So anyone that's listening that maybe has kids who are under 14, chances are they probably are Gen Alpha. Obviously, they're too young to start work yet. So I think I'm going to be touching upon them a little bit in today's episode. But obviously for Gen Alpha, lots of what is said really is kind of just predictions, because obviously they haven't actually started the world of work.
No. And my children definitely fall into that category. So really interested to understand a little bit more about what that future of work looks like. So what, from your perspective, are some of the standout emerging generational themes that are coming through in the workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think before I go into that, I want to highlight that I think fundamentally everyone, regardless of age group, regardless of generation, I do fundamentally think everyone wants the same things at work. Specifically, everybody wants to enjoy the job they're doing. They want to work around people they enjoy. They want to be earning a decent amount. They want to progress in their career. So I do think fundamentally everybody wants the same thing regardless of generation. However, there are some key differences maybe between Gen Z to other generations. For example, things like work-life balance. Traditionally, maybe sometimes older generations or even people that have been working for a little bit longer, traditionally they can be kind of all about work, and they feel like you need to work 24/7, 7 days a week. You have to kind of always be on. Whereas Gen Z, work isn't their be all and end all, and they do understand and appreciate that you can still be successful and you can still progress in your career without being on 24/7. And I think partly a lot of that mindset has actually been learned through seeing friends and family members who have maybe worked for 20 to 30 years and don't always have that much to show for it, or maybe have worked for a particular employer for 20 years and have just been made redundant and been laid off like that, and their loyalty hasn't really been rewarded. So I feel like that mindset, they've kind of learnt that from family and friends. I think another example is, and again, this isn't for everyone, but maybe traditionally generations who have been working for longer, they would maybe go for kind of any job because they needed a job, or they go for a job just because it's high paying and it's not necessarily something they're interested or passionate about. Whereas typically younger people, and again, money is of course important to them, but equally they would much rather be spending their working lives doing a job that they actually enjoy. So are more likely to go for jobs that they know they're passionate about or have an impact, rather than I'm going to apply for this job because I need a job or it gets me loads of money. So I think those are some of the key differences. There's lots of others in like things like communication and ways they work, but I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about those in a second. So yeah, I'd say those are some of the main ones.
That's really interesting. I think we'll pick on some of those delve into them in a little bit more detail, particularly around some of the myths, but also what are some of the similarities as well. I think that'd be really interesting to explore. I know from our perspective in the West Midlands region, only 35% of our workforce fall within that age category that you've mentioned. And in terms of being under 30, and only, I think it's just 2.5% of our workforce placements are through graduates or apprenticeship schemes. So I suppose what's the risk for us as employers if we're not engaging with these generations? And what's the impact in terms of that for us in terms of our future services and also our future workforce?
Well, I think first and foremost, you're missing out on an amazing pool of talent. Young people have so many new, fresh and unique perspectives to bring to an organisation. And I'm sure we all know when we've worked at an organisation for several years, a lot of the time our mindset and the way we think can be very kind of only within that organisation. So it's really important to bring young people in because they do have those unique perspectives. They have loads of amazing technical skills and digital skills as well. But I think also ultimately, people can't work forever. So there'll just ultimately be a skill shortage if you aren't engaging young people. You're going to have roles that you aren't able to fill, and also your organisation is probably going to be a little bit out of touch, especially when it's a local council. They're to serve everyone. They're to serve people of all generations. So having people in charge and people working there that are only of a certain age group, you're not really going to be able to relate to the whole population that you're actually serving, which is another reason why it's really important to have a variety of age groups and generations.
Absolutely, and I think you hit the nail on the head there in terms of, because we do have hard to fill roles, we also have an ageing workforce and we're acutely aware of that. So now is the time we need to really be proactively thinking about what strategies are there that we need to be implying. So in terms of hard to fill roles, we have those across health and social care, in terms of ICT, data, planning, etc. What strategies could councils be employing to make those roles more appealing and make the sector more appealing to Generation Z?
Well, there's lots of things, but I think first of all, I personally, I don't really have, and I wouldn't have had, and obviously now I'm kind of in the industry, I have a bit more idea, but I still have no idea what kind of job opportunities there actually are within the local council. So taking some time to kind of demystify what those actually are, because probably most people, they think, oh, you're either working in an office or you either have to be an MP or you either have to represent your community, when I'm sure there's lots of different roles. So really, demystifying what those job opportunities actually are, the different departments, but obviously doing that in a way that actually resonates with young people. So whether that's meeting them where they're at, so whether that's creating content online, potentially on the likes of TikTok or something like that, where that is where young people do spend their time. And maybe we may have some listeners kind of cringing at the thought of doing that, or thinking, I have no idea how to be on TikTok, or isn't that just a dancing app? It's not. There's so many companies using that for amazing attraction purposes, and they're having loads of success because they're meeting young people where they're at. So I think that's really important. If you don't know how to do that, there are definitely companies that can help you do that. So definitely meeting them where they're at and using where they're at as a tool to educate on the roles that are actually available and what those mean, removing that jargon that they're probably not going to understand and they have no clue what that means. And also, using people that look like them and using people that they can relate to, which you may struggle with because it sounds like there's not many under 30s. But there, of course, are different ways behind that. So I think probably first and foremost, meeting them where they're at, either online or in person at schools, colleges, universities, etc., and just kind of bringing some of those careers to life. It's 2024. You can no longer just post a job posting on your job board and expect people to find it. That's just not how things work, especially when most of the time, lots of the job titles I do see, they're full of jargon. No young person is going to know to search that because they don't know it exists. So I think those are some ways that I'd recommend.
I think that's really helpful, and I know we're on a journey starting to do some of that myth busting about what is local government, what's it like to work in local government, what are the breadths of roles. But I really like that point that resonated with me about meeting the candidates that we're trying to attract where they are. So actually, let's brace social media. Let's use things like TikTok. We've seen other sectors invest in terms of have influencers that actually are employed by their companies to kind of demystify some of those myths. So I think there's a lot we need to do, we're only at the starting point of that journey, and I think working and understanding the insights that you've shared is actually something, giving us food for thought on that areas. That's really helpful.
Yeah, definitely. And around the myth busting piece, in November I just finished working with the civil service fast stream on the campaign, which was all around myth busting around the civil service. So I worked on a campaign with them which is around and busting the myth around like what do civil servants actually wear to work. And it was really cool because they hosted a vintage like kilo clothing sale at Birmingham University. And then I was there like interviewing students, asking them, what do you think a civil servant would want to wear to work? There were some civil servants there. And then we also did some content around picking out outfits. And yeah, like most of the students did just think to work in the civil service, you have to wear a suit and tie, which just isn't true at all. So even just small things like that doesn't have to be TikTok. It can be in-person activities where you're partnering with organisations like universities and things like that to meet students where they're at as well.
Yeah, I really like that creativity, that innovation, that actually let's think out of the box and work in partnership with some of these institutions as well to kind of create that movement. That's really helpful. I like that. And on that point about myth busting, I think there's so many discussions around stereotypes. We hear sometimes in the headlines that Gen Z are lazy, they're entitled, or there's a lack of resilience. So what's your response to some of those claims, and what's the truth behind some of those headlines?
I think the headlines are really frustrating because whether we realize it or not, whether people listening realize it or not, we're all seeing those headlines, and whether we realize it or not, they are creating biases and thoughts in our mind about a particular group of people before they even walk in the door, which isn't fair. And equally also, and again, this is one of the things I actually do when I'm going into organisations, one of the first questions I ask is, what stereotypes existed when you started the world of work? Because if you ask that question, actually, a lot of the same stereotypes still exist today, and they're just thrown onto every single generation. So I think they're a little bit frustrating. I think just to explain some of them, I don't think Gen Z are lazy. I think they're literally the complete opposite, to be honest. They are one of the actual main pain points and feedback I get from the organisations I work with is that they want to run before they can walk. That's one of the biggest themes. And that is just the complete opposite of lazy. Lots of organisations have young people come into work and they want to progress instantly. They think in 2 months they're going to get promotion, which again, I think at school and in education at university, no one is teaching you what realistic paths to progression actually look like. They aren't getting that information from anywhere. And not everyone is from a privileged background where they have family members working corporate or family friends. So where are they going for that information to learn about what realistic paths of their careers look like? They're going to social media. And social media can be great in many ways, but it's also full of some not so great content where people say things for views and they say things that they know is going to push the algorithm and get their video watched more. So yeah, they'll be seeing online of maybe a young person that probably works for a startup of like 3 people who, maybe started as an assistant and is now a manager 6 months later. Yes, that's because they work in a company of 3 people. They don't work in a company of 10,000 people. So it's creating these unrealistic expectations, which they then come into work and they think, oh, okay, if I do my job well, I'm going to be a manager in 6 months. And for a lot of them, that can be a shock. So I think definitely that's another piece. I think the laziness piece, I also don't agree with. I think some of that boils down to the fact that they just have boundaries, right? Because realistically, in today's age, young people, they're doing everything that they've been told to do by society, right? They're going to school, they're getting good grades. Maybe they go to university, they spend 4 years doing a degree. They're doing everything they've been told by society. Then they they get that degree or they get their qualifications. You can't even find a job, right? The average time it takes a graduate to find a job in the UK at the moment is 6 months. They then get that job and they're on a super low salary because cost of living is so high. So realistically, they aren't actually ever going to, or anytime soon, going to be able to get these basic things that have been sold to them by society, like buying a house or going traveling or whatever. So they're almost like, I've worked so hard, I'm not even going to be able to get these things. Why am I going to be busting my ass off for an employer for 20 years and working extra hours when I'm not actually getting paid for it? And equally, I'd rather spend my time outside of work creating a side hustle where I can make some of that extra money. So I think the laziness piece is a generational thing where maybe older generations are used to being super loyal to an employer and are really willing to work those extra hours. And that's not to say young people aren't willing to work extra hours, but they're not going to work them every day. They'll maybe work them every so often. So I think the laziness piece I don't know. I think part of it is a little bit of, this may make me sound controversial, I do think part of it is a little bit of jealousy, because I think a lot of the time older generations wish they had the guts to do and say some of the things that Gen Z are saying and put some of those boundaries in place. They wish they could. So their default reaction through insecurity, through whatever it is to just call them lazy, but they're not lazy. From their perspective, they don't have any time to waste, especially when you throw COVID in. Many of them, including myself, I feel like I lost 2-3 years of my life because I was sat at home. I wasn't able to, people weren't able to get internship opportunities. People that were going to university, they didn't even go in. They lost 2 years of their lives. And then they do start that job and they're on very, very minimum wage and they have high expectations for themselves. So from their perspective, they really have no time to waste. So they aren't going to stay in an environment where the professional opportunities aren't there, or they've worked really hard for 2 years and they haven't just got a pay rise. They are going to leave because from their side, they are in a rush to do things.
You mentioned side hustle, and actually that's the opposite of laziness. That's showing entrepreneurial skills and
Exactly.
wanting to work hard in an alternative kind of outside of the kind of typical job role that they might have. What I think is really interesting is that there's I think an education piece around the myth busting, that employers do have a role to play, and the other element is a challenge that we're grappling in, and there's a big kind of, I suppose, region-wide conversation that we're taking place is actually how do we prepare ourselves for that future of work? Because it's all really well if we work with individuals like yourself and we really think about actually how are we going to attract Gen Z into the organisation, but actually once they're in the organisation, how do we make sure we retain them in the organisation? What's that kind of culture of the organisation? Is the organisation even ready for Gen Z and allowing them to kind of flourish? And I think there's a notion there in terms of that typical way of maybe having promotions and through hierarchies. That's not necessarily the right way, or certainly not how other generations will look to approach that or wait for a promotion opportunity to come up. So how do we think about squiggly careers? How do we think about those horizontal moves and giving people opportunities within the same organisation? And it's really unpicking the way we work and how we operate to really meet some of those needs. So I think from my perspective, I think it's a challenge, but also an opportunity. And we need to be thinking about that now. So Absolutely. I think that's been really helpful, some of those elements of how you see it from a different perspective in terms of some of those myths. Shoshana, you mentioned COVID, the cost of living crisis, and the influence of social media, and the huge impact that that's had on Gen Z. In terms of how that might have then influenced and shaped their values, how can we really work in local government to make sure that we see that as an opportunity? How can we meet some of those values and expectations for that Gen Z?
Well, I think definitely delving into some of those values around kind of balance, wanting to have impact in their work. This is a big one that I see. Everyone wants to be satisfied with the work they're doing and wants to feel like they have, a wider impact on society and the world. And a lot of the time that's not super clear, especially when you're starting your first role and you're kind of given some of those admin-y or boring-y tasks. And when you've kind of thought, oh, I'm joining this company to have an impact. So I think just really simple things like being really, really clear on the work they're doing and why they're being asked to do that, and also the impact that actual specific work has on the wider team and the wider business. Because a lot of the time you don't know. To you it just looks like you're updating an Excel spreadsheet and you don't know where that information is going. But if you actually knew that that information was then being used by the senior leadership team to go and project the business goals next quarter, you'd be like, oh my God, I'm actually doing something. So even just being really, really clear on why they're being asked to do specific work. I think also, being transparent around progression, what that looks like, how they're able to get there. As I said before, Gen Z aren't aliens, so also just going at it from an aspect of we're all humans, we all do fundamentally want the same things, and actually you probably have more in common with them than you think. And if you don't get them, they also probably don't get you. It's funny to them. Like I remember when I started my first job and there were people that had been at the company longer than I'd been alive, and I just found that so weird. I was like, what? Why would someone want to work at a company for like 20 plus years? But to them, that's completely normal. So equally, they don't get you. And there's lots of kind of getting to know each other. But I think if we do take the time to get to know them and not overthink it, there are going to be loads of similarities and they're going to bring loads of great ideas, which are actually going to benefit the wider organisation and the wider business, not just them.
I think that's really helpful. And I think you're right, actually. A lot of those are similarities, and it's about recognising some of those similarities. What would be your top tips for organisations in local government that are looking to attract and retain Gen Z in the workplace? And how can we as councils kind of position ourselves as being employers of choice? Because earlier you mentioned around Gen Z wanting to make a difference. And that's the reason why many individuals have actually gone into public sector, because of the value set of wanting to make a difference. And I think there's a lot we can absolutely show how that delivers and how each individual contributes to that impact. So it really resonates, actually, I think, as a sector to the values and the kind of what the needs are for Gen Z. But there's a missing piece at the moment. So how do we make sure, how do we proposition ourselves better in terms of being that attractive employer?
Well, I think definitely echoing the tip I said before, meet them where they're at. And because there are lots of organisations that I'll maybe give a tip to, it's like, you need to do this or you need to explain your roles, and they'll say, we're doing this, we've got all this on our website, and it's like the longest web pages you've ever seen. You click on it and it's like explains what this job title is in like really long paragraphs. It's like, yes, you've done it, but it's not easily consumable. Not everyone consumes content in the same way. Would you want to read a 2-page blog about a job? No. So I think meeting them where they're at and having the information in a way that's easy to consume to them, and actually easy to consume for anyone, because I'm sure most people would rather listen to like a short podcast or watch a short video rather than read like a really, really long blog. So I think if you are listening and you're like, okay, I do this, you need to meet them where they're at. You need to use people that look like them. So young people, if you have them, people from all backgrounds and cultures and genders, people that they can relate to, essentially. Because it's great having a senior leader come and speak. There's definitely value, but for them that's quite far removed. It's like, yeah, okay, this person was me like 25 years ago. It's hard to relate to. And so definitely those things. I think it's really, really important for organisations to actually, again, this is just a short podcast, but there's lots of themes that are coming up at work for young people, whether that be anxiety, whether that be mental health, whether that be cost of living. And I do feel like lots of organisations are kind of quite far removed from that, and they don't really have much empathy or understanding for struggles that young people in 2024 are actually going through and are actually facing. So really understanding those, and that's actually one of the main pieces of work I do. I work with managers and leadership teams to help them actually understand the young people they're hiring, and then based on that understanding, they can engage them better. So I think that's important, because yeah, there are certain behaviours that show up at work. Like, just because someone doesn't have their camera on, that doesn't mean they're lazy, that doesn't mean they're entitled, that doesn't mean they're not interested. There's a multitude of reasons. They could not be comfortable with how they look. They could be living in a flat share of like 10 other people. They could be used to attending online uni lectures where no one has their camera on, so no one's ever told them they need to have their camera on. So I think just understanding them is really, really important for retention, because otherwise assumptions are made and judgments are made. And I think the final retention piece is is around, again, this isn't different for anyone, but is around progression and I think satisfaction and ultimately salary. If you aren't, I always say to young people, you need to kind of be either earning or learning. And if you're not getting either, you probably need to leave, essentially. So I'm not saying it's all about money. It's not all about money. Of course, they deserve to be paid like a livable wage. But if they aren't progressing and they're not earning a decent wage, then it's kind of like, well, what is there for you? So looking at those two things as well.
Okay. No, that's really helpful. And I think if that's really helpful tips from an organisation employer's perspective in terms of the attraction, meet those individuals, make sure that the content you're creating is relevant and actually it's coming from individuals that look like them and can share that kind of lived experience of what it feels like to be a Gen Z in the workplace. But also then there's, I think, for many of our kind of OD teams is really working with managers and leadership teams around actually let's create a culture that's actually going to allow those individuals not just to retain them, but make sure that their well-being, they're supported, but also in terms of actually what does progression look like as well for those individuals. So I think that's really helpful. Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us on our Public Sector I Heart You podcast, and I'm sure we'll be having further conversations in terms of how we attract and retain future generations. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.